The desert doesn't keep secrets. It just buries them in plain sight. For Josephine Monroe, an 18-year-old girl who knew the sting of alkali dust better than a mother's kiss, the land was a cruel parent. But on a freezing Tuesday in 1878, the wind whispered a sound that didn't belong to the canyons. It wasn't a coyote, and it wasn't the breeze. It was a cry thin as spider silk, leading her to an arroyo, where a decorated clay pot sat half buried in the sand. What she found inside would not only test her strength, but would ignite a war between her family, her town, and two worlds that were never meant to collide. The wind in the high Arizona desert was a liar. In the summer, it promised coolness that never came. In the winter, it carried the false warmth of the pale afternoon sun, only to turn to a blade of ice the moment the light dipped behind the western mesas. Josephine Josie Monroe knew this wind. She pulled her threadbare woolen shawl tighter, the grit scraping against her neck. She was checking her father's meager trap lines, a task she'd inherited 2 years prior, when her mother's lungs finally filled with the dust that defined their lives. Josie was 18, but her eyes held the weary patience of someone twice her age. Her world was a 20-mile radius of hardscrabble ranching, centered on a 2-room cabin built of sod and optimism. Today the traps were empty, not even a jackrabbit. Just the endless aching red of the rock and the pale, unforgiving blue of the sky. She was walking back through a familiar dry riverbed, the arroyo, as her father called it when she heard the sound. At first she mistook it for a hawk, but a hawk's cry was a sharp cree, a declaration of power. This was a thin, desperate mewling. It was the sound of something small failing to be heard. Josie stopped. The air was dead calm. The sound came again, weaker this time. It was coming from a cluster of greasewood bushes, huddled against a cut in the arroyo wall. She pushed aside the brittle branches, her eyes scanning the ground for a rattlesnake. Instead, she saw clay. It was a pot. Not the crude functional pottery her father sometimes bought from the traders in Red Creek, but something finer. It was decorated with intricate black and red geometric lines, the unmistakable work of the Diné, the Navajo. It was half buried, as if to hide it, or perhaps as if the earth had tried to reclaim it. And the sound was coming from inside. A cold dread sharper than the wind pricked Josie's skin. Stories of witchcraft, of strange rituals flooded her mind. Stories told by frightened settlers in the town. She reached out her hand, trembling, and touched the lid. It was a simple, flat piece of shale. She slid it aside. Inside, wrapped in a small, stiff piece of deer hide, and a thin woven blanket, was a baby. Its skin was a deep copper, but its lips and the skin around its eyes were tinged with a terrifying, dusty blue. It was so small. Its eyes were squeezed shut, its face wrinkled in a silent, exhausted plea. It was freezing. Not just cold, but freezing. The kind of cold that was the last step before death. Josie stared. Her mind went utterly blank. Who would do this? Why was it a sacrifice? Was it an offering to the spirits of the arroyo? The baby let out one more cry, so quiet it was barely a breath. It was the sound of a life guttering out. The blankness in Josie's mind shattered. It didn't matter why. It only mattered that it was. "Oh God," she whispered. She tore the baby from the pot, casting the stiff hide aside. The child was impossibly light. She ripped open her own coat and the front of her linen shirt, shoving the infant against the bare, warm skin of her stomach and chest, pulling her shawl and coat tight around them both. The baby's skin was like ice against hers. She didn't know if it was alive or dead. "No," she said to the baby, to the desert, to God. "You don't." She didn't walk back to the cabin. She ran. She ran through the greasewood, tripping on rocks, her lungs burning, one hand clamped over her coat to hold the tiny body secure. She didn't feel the cold anymore. She was a furnace, and she had to give this spark her fire. She burst through the cabin door 2 miles later, collapsing against the frame. Her father, Matthew Monroe, looked up from the harness he was mending. He was a tall man, made of whipcord and disappointment, his beard streaked with grey he hadn't earned at 45. "Josie, what is it you're white as a sheet?" Josie couldn't speak. She just stumbled to the hearth, unwrapping her coat. The baby tumbled into her hands. It was limp. Matthew's eyes widened. He dropped the harness. "In the name of heaven. What is that?" "It was in a pot." Josie panted, sinking to her knees by the fire. "In the arroyo, freezing. Pa, it's not breathing right." Matthew knelt beside her, his face a mask of conflict. He saw the baby's copper skin, the shape of its eyes, the jet-black hair matted to its skull. He didn't need the pot to tell him. "Josie," he said, his voice low and terrible. "That's a Navajo. That's an Indian. It's a baby." Josie screamed, her voice cracking. She snatched a clean rag from her mother's old sewing box and began rubbing the child's limbs hard, trying to force life back into them. "It's freezing to death. Get the warm water. Get the goat's milk." Matthew was frozen. He looked at the door as if expecting the entire tribe to be standing there. "Josie, you don't know what you've done. You don't know who left it or why. They leave the weak ones sometimes. Or it's a trap. It's a baby," she roared again, a sound so fierce her father flinched. She looked at the tiny blue-tinged face. "It's a boy, and he's dying. Help me, Pa. Help me." That broke the spell. Matthew Monroe was a man of weary pragmatism, but he was not a cruel man. He cursed a low, bitter sound and turned to the stove. "Get that water basin, and don't you build that fire up. I don't want the smoke seen for miles." As he worked, Josie continued her desperate massage. The cabin was silent, save for the roar of the wind outside and the frantic sound of cloth rubbing skin. Slowly, painfully, a wail erupted from the tiny chest. It was thin and weak, but it was a wail of life. Josie choked on a sob, pulling the baby to her chest. "There you are," she whispered, rocking him. "There you are. You're safe." Matthew turned from the fire, a tin cup of watered-down goat's milk in his hand. His face was grim. "Safe," he said. "Josie, girl, I reckon the danger has just begun." They worked for an hour, a frantic, silent team. Josie and Matthew turned the cabin into an infirmary. They bathed the infant in lukewarm water, careful not to shock his system. Josie found an old flannel nightgown of her mother's and tore it into strips, creating a makeshift swaddling. The baby, he was perhaps only a few days old, was frail, but the fight was returning to him. He latched onto a rag dipped in the warm goat's milk and suckled weakly. Josie, exhausted, finally sat in her mother's old rocker by the fire holding the child. The cabin was warm, the single room filled with the scent of wood smoke and steamed milk. A fragile peace settled. Matthew stood by the window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutter. "No one," he muttered. "No tracks, no one on the ridge." He turned to his daughter. The anger had faded from his face, replaced by a deep, profound anxiety. "Josie, we can't keep it." Josie's head snapped up. "What are you talking about? Look at him. He'll die. We can't just put him back." "We take him to Fort Grant," Matthew said, running a hand through his hair. "First light. The soldiers. They have scouts. They'll know what to do. They can find his people. His people left him. Pa. They left him in a pot to die of cold." Josie's voice was laced with a venom she rarely used. What kind of people do that? We don't know the story, Matthew argued, but his voice was weak. Maybe his mother died. Maybe the whole camp was sick. It's not our business, Josie. The folks in Red Creek, if they hear about this. Silas Kane. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Silas Kane was a name that carried weight. A wealthy rancher who owned the valley's water rights, Kane had lost his younger brother in an Apache raid 5 years ago. Since then, his hatred for all Indians, Apache, Navajo, Pima, it made no difference to him, was a sickness. He paid bounties for scalps and led a town committee that was little more than a lynch mob. Kane doesn't run this house, Josie said stubbornly. He runs this valley, Matthew countered. He finds out we're harboring a Navajo. He'll say we're trading with them. He'll say we're spies. He'll find a reason to burn us out, Josie, and you know it. Then no one finds out, she said. Matthew let out a harsh laugh. This is Red Creek, girl. Jedediah Stokes rides this way every Wednesday with the mail. You think he won't stop. You think he won't look in the window. You think he can't smell a secret. This ain't a stray pup, Josie. It's a match tossed in a dry barn. Before Josie could answer, the very devil they spoke of appeared. A clatter of hooves and the rattle of a wagon sounded outside. Matthew's face went white. It's Tuesday, he whispered, horrified. He's not due. Get him in the back, Josie hissed. She ran to the small curtained-off alcove where she slept, laying the baby in her cot and throwing a heavy blanket over him, praying he wouldn't make a sound. The door banged open without a knock. Jedediah Stokes filled the frame, a greasy, oversized man in a buffalo coat. He carried a mail sack in one hand and a rifle in the other. His eyes were small and darting. "Matthew!" he grunted, stamping dust onto the floor. "Josie. Jedediah," Matthew said, trying to sound casual. He moved to block the view of the hearth. "You're a day early." Supply wagon from Tucson came in. "Got a letter for you. From your mother." Jedediah's eyes roamed the cabin. He sniffed the air. "Smells different in here, like a wet nurse." "I was just boiling some milk," Josie said quickly, her heart hammering. "Goat's milk. It turned." Jedediah's gaze settled on the hearth. He saw the basin of water, the strips of flannel, the small cup. His eyes narrowed. "Looks like you was cleaning something. Or someone." "I cut my hand," Matthew lied, holding up his left hand, which was by chance wrapped in a rag from mending the harness. Jedediah wasn't convinced. He was a man who lived on the misfortunes and secrets of others. He took a step further into the room. "Funny thing, I was cutting across the north pasture by the arroyo, and I saw tracks, small boot prints. Looked like running." He smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "You running from something, Josie?" "I was cold," Josie said, her voice like ice. From the alcove, a tiny, unmistakable sound emerged, a high-pitched whimper. Jedediah froze. His smile widened. "Well now, what kind of coyote you got trapped in your bed, Josie?" He pushed past Matthew, who grabbed his arm. "That's my daughter's room, Jed." Jedediah shoved him off. "And this is my business." He ripped the curtain back. He stared at the cot. He saw the bundle of blankets. He lifted the top one. The baby boy stared back at him, his dark eyes wide. Jedediah Stokes let out a low whistle. "Saints preserve us," he whispered, a strange, excited glint in his eye. He looked back at Matthew and Josie. "So the rumors are true." "What rumors?" Matthew demanded. "That the Monroes turned Injun lovers," Jedediah said. "Found a stray, did you, a little copper-skinned viper?" "Poor get out," Josie said, her hand moving to the fireplace poker. "Oh, I'm going," Jedediah said, backing away, his hands raised. "I'm going. But this is news," This is big news. Silas Kane has been looking for a reason to clear the valley of the Navajo for good, and you just gave him one. You've brought a curse on this house, Matthew. A walking, breathing curse. He turned and bolted from the cabin, leaving the letter from Matthew's mother on the floor. He leaped onto his wagon, whipped his horse, and disappeared in a cloud of dust toward Red Creek. Matthew Monroe slowly bent and picked up the letter. He didn't open it. He just stared at the door. "He's right," he whispered. "Josie, what have you done?" Josie went to the cot and picked up the baby, who was now crying in earnest. She held him close, his small face buried in her neck. She looked at the fire at the red-hot embers. "He needs a name," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I'm calling him Ash, for the ashes that warmed him." "Josie," Matthew pleaded, "they're going to come for him." "Let them," Josie said, turning to face her father, the tiny infant held against her like a shield. "They'll have to come through me." The sun rose the next morning on a house under siege. Not a siege of rifles and arrows, but one of silence and fear. Matthew hadn't slept. He sat at the table, his shotgun loaded, watching the horizon. Josie had dozed in the rocker, Ash cradled in her arms. Every gust of wind, every skitter of a lizard sent a fresh jolt of panic through the cabin. But the attack they expected from Red Creek didn't come. Instead, mid-morning, a different dust cloud appeared on the road from the east. It was slow-moving, deliberate. It was a single sturdy buckboard wagon, covered, drawn by 2 healthy mules. "It can't be," Matthew whispered, lowering his shotgun. He squinted. It's her! It's Mother!" Josie's heart sank. If Silas Kane was the fire, her grandmother was the ice. Martha Monroe was a woman carved from New England granite and tempered by 60 years of stern, unbending Presbyterian faith. She had buried a husband, 2 daughters, and followed her only remaining son, Matthew, out to this godless desert, not out of love, but out of a grim sense of duty. She lived in a small, clean house in Tucson, and her twice-yearly visits were events of judgment and scrubbing. Matthew had forgotten the letter. Jedediah had delivered it. Arriving Wednesday. Have the lye soap ready. M. The wagon pulled up. Martha Monroe sat bolt upright on the driver's bench. She wore a high-collared black dress, even in the dust, and a bonnet that looked like a weapon. She didn't wait for Matthew to help her. She descended from the wagon with stiff precision. She was carrying a box. "Matthew, Josephine," she said, her voice as crisp as a winter morning. "You're looking thin, Matthew, and the porch is listing. Josephine, your hair is a fright." "Mother," Matthew said, wringing his hands. We weren't expecting you today. Jedediah just brought the letter yesterday." "I am punctual," Martha said, as if that explained everything. She marched past him into the cabin. "And you've left the door open, inviting every snake and scorpion." She stopped. Her eyes, the color of a frozen lake, swept the room. They landed on Josie, who was standing frozen by the hearth, and on the small, dark-haired bundle in her arms. Martha Monroe did not gasp. She did not recoil. She simply stopped. The air in the cabin became brittle. "Matthew," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Explain this." "Mother, it's a long story," Matthew stammered. "I have time," she said, placing the box on the table. Josie spoke, her voice clear and strong. "I found him, in the arroyo. He was in a pot, freezing to death. I saved him." Martha's eyes moved to Josie. She inspected her granddaughter as if she were a new and disturbing species of insect. "You saved him." "He was dying," Josie insisted. "And now," Martha said, "he will be the death of you." She walked over to Josie. She did not look at the baby. She looked at Josie's face. You have your mother's foolish heart. Compassion is a luxury on the frontier, Josephine. It is a weakness that gets people killed. You haven't saved a child. You've stolen a problem. He was abandoned, Josie said. You don't know that, Martha snapped. You know nothing of their ways. You have brought a hornet's nest into this house. By nightfall, this child's tribe could be upon us demanding blood for blood. By morning, the white men from that filthy town will be here, demanding a hanging. You have placed your father's head in a noose. What would you have me do? Josie cried. Let him die. Is that what your God would want? My God! Martha said, her eyes flashing. Demands wisdom, not sentiment. He demands we protect our own. You have chosen a heathen cub over your own father. Matthew Pale finally spoke. Mother, please. Jedediah Stokes already saw the baby. He rode to Red Creek, to Kane. We're in trouble. Martha's thin lips pressed into a white line. Stokes, that fat, gossiping coward, and Silas Kane, a man who mistakes his own rage for God's will. She was silent for a full minute, her mind working. Well, she said finally. What's done is done. The milk is spilt. She turned to the box she'd brought and unlatched it. Inside were not Bibles or cleaning supplies. It was food, a hard smoked sausage, a sack of beans, and 3 large, beautiful loaves of white bread baked in a proper oven. The sight of it made Josie's stomach ache. This was the bread from the title. Martha cut a thick slice of the bread and handed it to Matthew. She cut another and handed it to Josie. Eat. You'll need your strength. Fear makes the stomach weak, but you will not be weak in my presence. Josie took the bread. It was soft, real. It felt like a different life. Mother, Matthew said, what are we going to do? We are going to do, Martha said, taking off her bonnet and smoothing her steel-grey hair. What Munros have always done. We are going to survive. We will give the child to the marshal. No, Josie said. Marshal Brodie will just give him to Kane. Marshal Brodie is a man of the law, Martha said. He is weak, but he is not a murderer. It is the only way. You've invited the fox into the henhouse, Josephine. Now you must give him a chicken, so he doesn't kill you all. As she spoke, she walked to the hearth. She looked down at Ash, who was sleeping in Josie's arms. Her face softened, just for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something. It was gone as fast as it came. She reached out a bony finger and touched the baby's cheek. So small, she murmured. Then she looked up at Josie, her eyes hard again. Lord to orders, she said, closing her eyes. Bless this house, and bless this child, for he is born of trouble. And grant your servant Josephine the wisdom to see the folly of her heart, that she may repent of her pride and deliver us from the trial she has brought upon us. Amen. Josie's blood ran cold. This was the blessing. It wasn't a blessing for the baby. It was a curse on Josie. It was a prayer for Josie to surrender. I won't give him up, Josie whispered. Then you are a fool, Martha said, turning away. And you will be the one to answer for Matthew's life. She began unpacking the rest of her supplies, her movements sharp and angry. The bread in Josie's hand suddenly tasted like ash. The battle lines had been drawn not just with the town, but inside their own home. Jedediah Stokes had ridden his horse into a lather by the time he reached Red Creek. He didn't go to the marshal's office. He went to the Dusty Spur, the saloon and general store that served as the town's black heart. He burst in panting and roared for a whiskey. And one for Silas Kane if he's here. Silas Kane was always here. He sat in the back corner at a table piled with maps and deeds, flanked by 2 hired gunsmen with dead eyes and trigger-happy fingers. Kane was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a thick black beard and a permanent scowl. He looked up annoyed by the interruption. "What is it, Stokes? Can't you see I'm busy?" "I've got news, Mr. Kane," Jedediah sputtered, hurrying over. "News that'll interest you, about the Monroes." Kane spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Them that sad sack farmer and his half-wild daughter. What about 'em? They finally starve out." "Worse," Jedediah whispered, leaning in his voice full of conspiratorial glee. "They're traitors. They're harboring a Navajo, a baby." The saloon went quiet. Kane's head came up slowly, his eyes narrowing to slits. "A what?" "A baby, Mr. Kane. An Injun buck. Found it, she says. But I say it's a trade. I say they're in league with 'em, giving 'em food, maybe bullets, and now they've got a mascot." Kane's massive hand clenched around his whiskey glass so tight the glass broke. He didn't flinch as the liquor and blood ran over his knuckles. He stood up his chair, scraping loudly. "Boys," he said to his men, "saddle up." "Silas, wait," said Marshal Brodie, a small, nervous man with a drooping mustache who had been nursing a beer at the bar. "Now let's not be hasty. We don't know the facts. I'll ride out. I'll see to it." Kane turned to the marshal. "You'll see to what, Brodie? You'll see to it that they keep feeding it. You'll see to it that its family comes looking and slits all our throats in the night. You know the rule. No trading. No quarter. They're on my land, breathing my air, and they bring one of them into it." He pointed a bloody finger at Stokes. You're coming. You're going to show us." "Me, Mr. Kane, I'm just the messenger." "You're the witness," Kane roared. He turned to the other men in the saloon ranch, hands prospectors, drifters. "Are we going to let the Monroes invite the fox into our valley? Are we going to wait until they're all grown, that vipers spawn, and they come for our cattle and our women? We are going to root this out. Now." A ragged cheer went up. Men grabbed their rifles. Within 10 minutes, a posse of 15 armed, angry men was thundering out of Red Creek with Silas Kane at their head and a terrified Jedediah Stokes struggling to keep up. At the Monroe cabin, Martha was the first to hear them. She was scrubbing the floor. She'd declared it filthy within an hour of arriving when she stopped, her head cocked. "Riders," she said. "Many. Fast." Matthew's face drained of color. "It's Kane." He ran to the door and barred it. He grabbed his shotgun. "Josie," he said, his voice trembling. "Take Ash. Go to the root cellar. Hide. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "No," Josie said. She gently laid the sleeping baby in her cot, covering him. She picked up her own rifle, a smaller Winchester she used for hunting. "I won't hide. I brought this. I'll face it." "Josephine, do as your father says," Martha snapped. "I won't," Josie repeated, checking the rifle's action. "He's your son. I'm your granddaughter. Are we not our own?" "You said to protect our own. I'm protecting this house." A flicker of something, it might have been approval, passed over Martha's face. She nodded once. Foolish, but brave. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She did not reach for a gun. The riders burst into the small yard surrounding the cabin. "Matthew Monroe," Kane's voice boomed. Come out and face your neighbors." Matthew looked at the door. "He'll kill us all." "He'll try," Martha said. She unbarred the door, and to the shock of both Matthew and Josie, stepped out onto the listing porch. She stood there, a frail-looking old woman in a black dress facing 15 armed men. Kane, surprised, reined in his horse. Well, if it isn't the old crow herself. Get out of the way, old woman. We're here for the Injun." There is no Injun here, Mr. Kane. Martha said, her voice cutting through the tense air as clear as a bell. There is a house of God. And a child. Kane laughed. A child, I hear it's a buck, a little snake. We're here to snap its head off before it grows fangs. Now step aside. You will not, Martha said. She took a step forward. You are a godless, violent man, Silas Kane. You mistake your own grief for righteousness. But you will not defile this home. Defile! Kane sputtered, his face turning purple. I'm here to cleanse it. That thing is a pollution. Now move, or by God, we'll move you. He raised his pistol. Matthew, Josie, Martha called, never taking her eyes off Kane. Show them. Matthew and Josie appeared in the doorway, their rifles leveled. Kane's men faltered their horses, shifting nervously. They were ready for a farmer, not a family prepared for a war. You'd shoot your own kind for a savage. Kane roared, incredulous. I will shoot, Matthew said, his voice shaking but finding its steel. Any man who tries to cross my threshold without invitation. This is my land, my family. Get off it. Kane was trapped. He wanted blood, but he didn't want a fair fight. Shooting an old woman and a young girl in broad daylight. Even his own men might balk at that. He needed a better excuse. This ain't over, Kane spat. You're traitors, all of you. We'll be back. Maybe we'll wait for your friends to show up, he sneered, gesturing to the empty mesas. We'll kill you all together. You will answer to the law, Silas, Martha said. Marshal Brody knows. Marshal Brody. Kane laughed, a horrible barking sound. Brody is in his office writing a very long, very detailed report about how he couldn't possibly have stopped me. You're alone, you and your pet. He stared at Josie, his eyes filled with a terrifying personal hatred. You girl, you're the one. You're the snake lover. I'll remember you. He yanked his horse's head around. Ride out! The posse thundered away, leaving the yard empty and the air thick with menace and dust. Josie's knees gave out. She sagged against the doorframe, her rifle heavy as lead. Matthew leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Martha Monroe, however, simply smoothed her apron. She looked at Josie, who was trembling. You see, child, you see what you've done. You've made a monster hungry, and you've given him nothing to eat. He will come back, and next time he will not knock. She turned and went back inside, picking up her scrub brush. Matthew, this floor won't clean itself. And you, she said to Josie, tend to that child. Its crying will be the least of our worries. Josie watched her go, a strange, terrible respect mixing with her fear. Her grandmother hadn't saved them with compassion. She had saved them with an iron will that was colder and harder than Silas Kane's hate. The battle was won, but the war, Josie knew, was far from over. The departure of Kane's mob didn't bring peace. It brought a new, suffocating tension. The Monroe cabin became an island in a hostile sea. They were pariahs. No one rode by. The weekly mail wagon didn't come. They were alone with diminishing supplies and a growing, unspoken fear. Matthew took to patrolling the property line, shotgun in hand. Martha, in a strange show of pragmatic solidarity, organized their defense. She inventoried their food, their water, their ammunition. We will not be caught unprepared, she stated, as if planning for a hard winter rather than a mob. Josie's world shrank to the cabin and the child. Ash, as she called him, was growing stronger. He was a quiet, watchful baby, his dark eyes following Josie everywhere. She had fallen into a fierce, protective love that bordered on obsession. This tiny life was no longer an abstract problem. He was hers. She sang him her mother's old, tuneless lullabies and whispered promises that she would never let anyone hurt him. But the desert was watching. 3 days after the confrontation, Josie was outside hanging laundry, a task Martha insisted upon, claiming, "Idleness breeds despair." She felt a prickle on her neck, that same feeling from the arroyo. She looked up at the ridge a mile distant, a figure, on horseback, just sitting, too far to see detail, but it was not a settler. The silhouette was wrong. She hurried inside. "Pa, someone's on the ridge." Matthew and Martha joined her. They watched. The figure sat for an hour, unmoving a speck against the sky. Then, as silently as it appeared, it was gone. "A scout," Matthew breathed. "They're looking for him." "Of course they are," Martha said, her voice flat. "What did you expect?" The fear now had a new shape. Before, it was the white-hot rage of Silas Kane. Now it was the cold patient unknown of the Navajo. Were they angry? Were they grieving? Were they coming to trade or to take? The next day, 2 figures appeared. The day after 4. They never came closer. But they were a constant, silent presence, a jury on the horizon. "They're afraid," Josie whispered, watching them. "They're afraid of us." "They're smart," Matthew countered. "They see a cabin with armed guards. They probably think we're the ones who took him." The weight of that settled on Josie. What if they thought she was the enemy? On the 5th day, the stalemate broke. Josie was milking their single goat, Bess, in the small lean-to. Ash was asleep inside. Matthew was checking the south fence line. Martha was inside baking. The smell of fresh bread, using the last of her good flour, was a torment. A shadow fell over the lean-to opening. Josie sprang up, her heart leaping into her throat. Her rifle was inside. Standing in the doorway was a woman. She was old, her face, a beautiful tragic map of wrinkles. She wore traditional Navajo dress, a woven blanket, a velvet shirt, and silver jewelry that was tarnished with dust. She was bone thin, and she was clearly desperately exhausted. She held no weapon. Her hands were empty, held palms up in a sign of peace. It was a woman. Alone. An old woman. Josie's fear evaporated, replaced by a jolt of pure shock. The woman's eyes were locked on Josie, pleading. She said something, a soft, guttural string of words. Josie shook her head. I don't understand." The old woman took a halting step forward. She pointed to the cabin. Then she made a gesture, rocking a baby in her arms. She looked at Josie, her black eyes swimming with a grief so profound it was almost visible like heat shimmer. "The baby," Josie whispered. You're here for the baby." The woman nodded, tears welling. She pointed to herself. "Shima Sani," she said. The word meant nothing to Josie. The woman tried again, pointing to the rocking gesture, and then to herself. "Grandmother." This was the other grandmother. Josie's mind reeled. She had built a story of abandonment of cruel heathen people. But the woman standing before her was not a monster. She was a grieving woman. The cabin door opened. Martha Monroe stood there, a spatula in her hand, her face hard. Matthew ran up from the fence line, shotgun at the ready. "Josie, get away from her!" Matthew yelled. The Navajo woman flinched, terrified. She held up her hands again. "No, Pa, wait," Josie said, stepping between them. "She's not a threat. Look at her. She's his grandmother." "His—" Matthew lowered his gun, confused. The old woman saw Martha. She saw another grandmother. Her face crumpled. She began to speak a fast, desperate torrent of Navajo, gesturing to the sky, to the east, to her own body. It was a story. Josie watched, mesmerized. I don't know what she's saying." The woman stopped. She knew they didn't understand. She had to show them. She pointed east. She mimicked the sound of gunfire. Pop, pop, pop. She made a gesture of men on horses riding fast. Soldiers, Josie thought, or bandits. The woman clutched her chest, her face a mask of terror. She scooped up an imaginary baby, holding it tight. She pointed to another imaginary person, a younger woman. She mimicked this person falling. The mother. She was killed. The old woman wept silent tears, carving tracks in the dust on her face. Then she showed them. She ran. She gestured, running, falling, hiding. She pointed to the arroyo. She pointed to the clay pot, mimicking its shape with her hands. She placed her baby inside, covered it. She made a gesture of waiting, of hiding. Then the gunfire sound again. The men. She was found. She pointed to her own arm, her side. She had been hurt, chased. She ran and ran and ran. Josie finally understood. It wasn't abandonment. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was a desperate act of love. She had hidden the baby from the attackers, intending to come back, but she was captured or driven off. She had spent days, perhaps a week, escaping, doubling back, searching, starving. The woman finished her story. She looked at Josie, her entire being a question. Is he alive? Josie was crying. She didn't leave him to die, Pa. She hid him. To save him. She turned, ran into the cabin and retrieved the sleeping baby, Ash. She brought him out into the sunlight. When the Navajo grandmother saw him alive, healthy, warm, a sound left her throat that Josie would never forget. It was a sound of agony and joy and relief, so profound it was almost a physical thing. She fell to her knees, her arms outstretched. Josie, her own tears blurring her vision, knelt and placed the baby in his grandmother's arms. The woman clutched the child, burying her face in his swaddling rocking and chanting a soft, low song. Josie looked up at her father. Matthew's face was a ruin of pity and shame. He quietly uncocked his shotgun, but Martha Monroe just watched her face, unreadable, her spatula still in her hand. The five of them stood in the yard, a tableau of impossible worlds colliding. A settler farmer, a frontier girl, a Navajo grandmother weeping over a child, and Martha Monroe, a Puritan monolith standing on her porch. The baby Ash woke at the new touch, the new smell. He looked at the Navajo woman's tear-streaked face, and instead of crying, his own face relaxed. He gurgled a soft, contented sound. He was home. She needs food, Josie said, her voice thick. Pa, she's starving. The Navajo elder looked up, her gaze landing on Martha. The two grandmothers stared at each other. One in buckskin and velvet, covered in the dust of the desert, her hands raw and scraped. The other in black bombazine, her hands clean, her power absolute in her tiny, civilized world. It was Martha who moved first. She turned wordlessly and went back into the cabin. Josie felt a pang of anger. Was she just going to ignore this? To leave the woman on her knees in the dirt? Matthew stepped forward, holding out a canteen. "Water, Mom," he said, his voice rough. The woman looked at him, startled, then accepted it, nodding her thanks. She drank long and deep. The cabin door opened again. Martha Monroe emerged. She was carrying two things. In one hand, she held a clean cloth. In the other, she held the fresh, steaming loaf of bread she had just taken from the oven. She walked down the porch steps. She did not stop at a safe distance. She walked right up to the Navajo elder. The woman flinched, pulling the baby closer, expecting a blow or a demand. Martha stopped. She looked at the baby. Then she looked at the woman. She looked at her scraped, raw hands. Wordlessly, Martha tore a huge, soft piece from the loaf of bread, the bread from the title The Bread of Civilization. She held it out. The Navajo woman stared at the offering. This was more than food. It was a truce. It was an acknowledgement. Slowly she reached out her free hand and took it. She ate it fast, as if afraid it would be taken back. Martha tore off another piece. "Eat," she said. The command was not harsh. It was just a fact. Then Martha did the last thing anyone expected. She reached out and placed her clean, pale hand on the baby's head, still held in the Navajo woman's arms. The woman stiffened. Martha looked at her grandmother to grandmother. She gave a single small nod. A gesture of respect, a ceding of title. This was the blessing, not the one she had given Josie, which was a prayer of rebuke. This was a true blessing, a blessing of life, a blessing of a child's safe return. Josie felt the knot of fear and anger inside her finally dissolve, replaced by a warmth that was almost painful. Her grandmother, in her own iron-willed way, understood. A sound shattered the moment. A single rifle shot. The bullet cracked through the air, splintering the porch post where Martha had been standing moments before. "Down!" Matthew roared, tackling Josie. The Navajo elder shielded the baby with her body, rolling toward the cabin wall. "Kane!" Matthew yelled, scrambling for his shotgun. "He's back!" On the ridge not a mile distant was not the small group of Navajo. It was Silas Kane and his entire committee, at least 20 men silhouetted against the morning sky. They had seen the Navajo woman enter the Monroe yard. They had waited. "They're trapped." Kane's voice roared faint on the wind. "They're all together. The traitors and the savages. Burn them out." A volley of gunfire erupted. Bullets thumped into the sod walls of the cabin, shattered the single window, and pinged off the cast-iron stove. "Inside, get inside!" Matthew yelled. Josie grabbed the elder's arm, pulling her and the baby through the door, as Matthew and Martha tumbled in after. The cabin was instantly a death trap. Bullets punched through the thin plank door. "The back!" Martha commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority, no panic. "Josie, take them to the root cellar. Matthew, the window. Don't let them get close." "They've got us surrounded!" Matthew yelled, peering through a crack. "They're coming down the ridge." Josie pulled the terrified elder toward the trap door in the floor, but the woman resisted. She was looking at Matthew at his shotgun. She pointed at it, then at herself, then at the baby. She was asking for a weapon. "She wants to fight," Josie said, amazed. "She'll have to," Martha said grimly. She was already loading Matthew's spare pistol. Another volley hit. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of sulfur. Then a new sound. It was a cry, a high, ululating war cry. "What in God's name now?" Matthew breathed. Josie looked out the shattered window. The men on the ridge, Kane's men, were no longer firing at the cabin. They were disorganized. They were shouting. From the other ridge, the one to the west, a line of riders was charging. It was the Navajo, the 4 scouts who had been watching, and behind them, 10, maybe 15 more. They had seen Kane's attack, and they were charging down to save their elder. "Oh my God," Josie whispered. "Pa, it's the others. They're attacking Kane." Kane's men were caught completely disastrously between the fortified cabin and a charging party of Navajo warriors. Panic ripped through their line. They were ranchers, not soldiers. They broke. "They're running!" Matthew shouted, a wild, incredulous laugh in his voice. "They're running!" The battle was a rout. The Navajo, fueled by rage, swept through Kane's disorganized mob. It was over in minutes. Kane's men scattered, fleeing in every direction. Only one man held his ground, trapped. Silas Kane. He had been unhorsed. He got to his feet, his rifle in hand, and found himself facing the cabin. The cabin door opened. Matthew Monroe stepped out, his shotgun leveled. Kane saw him. He saw the cold fury in the farmer's eyes. He saw Martha and Josie emerge behind him. He saw the Navajo woman in the doorway clutching the child he had come to kill. He was beaten, defeated by everyone he hated. "Get off my land," Matthew said, his voice low and shaking with adrenaline. "And if you ever come back, I will not wait for you to fire first." Silas Kane, his face a mask of humiliation and bile, looked at the oncoming Navajo warriors. He dropped his rifle and ran. He stumbled into the scrub, a defeated, broken man. The yard was silent. The Navajo warriors, their task complete, pulled up their horses, forming a perimeter. They did not approach the cabin. They just waited. The battle was over. The dust settled. The air was acrid with the smell of black powder. In the yard, there was a tense, fragile peace. The Monroe family stood on their porch, wounded but alive. The Navajo warriors sat on their horses, watchful. The Navajo elder Ash's grandmother stepped out of the cabin. She held the baby close. She looked at her people and then back at Josie. This was the moment. Josie's heart felt like it was being torn in two. For a week, this child had been her entire world. He was Ash. He was hers. She had saved him. But she hadn't. She had just borrowed him. She stepped off the porch. The elder met her in the middle of the yard. Josie reached out and touched Ash's cheek. He was warm, his eyes bright. He was safe. "Be good," Josie whispered, her voice breaking. She was crying freely now, not caring who saw. "Be strong." The Navajo grandmother looked at Josie. Her own eyes were full. She saw the girls love her sacrifice. She gently shifted the baby to one arm and reached to the turquoise necklace she wore. It was old, the beads worn smooth. She pulled one small, perfect turquoise bead from a leather string at her wrist. She took Josie's hand and pressed the bead into her palm, closing the girl's fingers around it. It was a gesture of profound, unspeakable thanks. A life for a life. A heart for a heart. Josie clutched the bead as if it were a burning coal. "Thank you," she whispered. Martha Monroe stepped forward. She was carrying the rest of the bread and a large pouch. She too approached the elder. The two grandmothers stood face to face again. Martha handed the bread loaf to the woman. Then she pushed the heavy pouch into her hands. "Jerky," Martha said, "and beans, for the child, for the journey." The Navajo elder looked at the provisions, then at Martha. She nodded a deep, respectful bow. Martha nodded back. She then spoke, her voice clear in the quiet yard. "Diego." It was a Navajo word. Josie's head snapped up. The elder's eyes widened in surprise. Martha's face was grim. "I was a girl in Fort Defiance. Long ago. It means go. Go before more come." The elder understood. She turned and walked with a new, straight-backed dignity toward her people. A young warrior dismounted, helped her onto his horse, and handed her the reins. She settled the baby against her, turned her horse, and without looking back, rode toward the western mesa. The other warriors fell in around her, a protective guard. Josie, Matthew, and Martha stood on their porch, watching. They watched until the last rider was just a speck of dust, vanishing into the red canyons from which they had come. The cabin was a wreck. The window was gone. The door was splintered, but the three of them were alive. Matthew put a hand on Josie's shoulder. His arm was bleeding where a piece of shrapnel had grazed him. "You did a good thing, daughter." Josie looked at her hand. The turquoise bead was a tiny, perfect piece of blue sky. "We did, Pa," she said. Martha Monroe stared at the empty horizon. "The bread is gone," she said to no one in particular, "and the floor is still dirty." She turned and went back inside the cabin, picked up her brush, and began to scrub. But as she did, Josie, for the first time in her life, saw her grandmother smile. What Josephine Monroe learned that day, in the dust and the gunfire, was a truth the frontier teaches best family. isn't just the blood you're born with, but the blood you're willing to shed. The desert, which had seemed so empty, was full of stories, full of mothers and grandmothers, full of desperate love and impossible courage. Josie, her father, and her grandmother had been broken and rebuilt, not by the violence of men like Silas Cain, but by the shared strength of two women who refused to let a child's life be stolen by the cold. The turquoise bead Josie held in her hand was more than a gift. It was a promise that even in the harshest land, kindness can take root. That bread shared between enemies can become a blessing, and that one small act of compassion can be enough to change the world. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, please help us share more stories like it. Click that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Josie's choice. Until next time.